Hello, I'm Devin, and you're listening to Tools and Craft. Today, I'm talking to Loretta Staples. Loretta is hard to sum up in a short description. She's worked as a textile curator, a software designer, a graphic designer, a professor, a co-founder of Yale's Buddhist chaplaincy, a painter, and now a therapist. And there's probably even more that I missed from that long list. Loretta has also worked in a wide variety of settings, including corporate environments like Apple in the 90s, her own design studio, a self-run therapy practice, academia, and beyond. I'm excited to talk to Loretta because she's someone who doesn't let conventional professional categories constrain her from building and doing the things that she wants to see in the world. So Loretta, thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
Thank you. Nice to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. So my first question is, do you remember the first time that you used Photoshop, and how did you originally come across the tool?
So this is many years ago. I guess we're talking about late 80s or early 90s. I remember Adobe Illustrator much more, and I can't remember whether that preceded Photoshop or not. But that I do remember, mostly I remember how conceptually interesting and elegant it was, how it actually worked with kind of control points and those little handles that you would pull out, and just the way of constructing geometry was very it just seemed so new in such a curious way, especially if you came from a world of compasses and circle templates. It was a very, and rulers, it's a radically, and T-squares. It's a very radically different way of drawing geometry. So that I remember. Photoshop I don't remember all that much, quite honestly. I don't remember using it all that much, except for, certain kind of photo effects. And I wasn't particularly interested personally in effects or effect-driven kind of aesthetics, especially. Symbolically, I was interested, and I wrote an article. I know you know this article. I wrote an essay about that in the early 90s on blurring. But I don't remember really being that engaged in Photoshop as a tool, even though I knew it was incredibly important and powerful. Yeah.
What were the tools that you used most commonly in your work, and what sort of was the process that you would put a particular type of project through?
I remember when the term experience design kind of emerged. Because I actually wrote an essay, which I never published, called "Are You Experienced?" after Jimi Hendrix's song, and it was about kind of the emergence of that term. But in the late 80s, there were some people, mostly in computer science and technical fields, who were kind of pursuing interface design, or GUI, again, graphical user interface design. And so they were from a different world. I had a background in art history and graphic design. And even though there were some people with graphic design backgrounds who were starting to enter the field, I think we were still very much in the minority. The piece of software that came out that really kind of gave me a point of entry into the field was actually HyperCard, Apple's HyperCard, because it was a prototyping tool. You could use it to prototype interaction. And so I do remember HyperCard. I remember it had a scripting language built into it. And so that was a tool that I remember a lot of people using early on to start prototyping stuff and scripting interaction. And it had very crude drawing tools. It was black and white. When I started, it was black and white world. And then it became a 16 color world, I think, at some point. You had a limited number of colors to work with, limited interaction. But HyperCard was really kind of a seminal tool. I remember editing icons in ResEdit. That was a developer tool from Apple. I remember, I think it was Studio 8. I think none of these tools haven't existed, I think, in quite a long while. Studio 8, I think, became Studio 32 at some point. Also had some scripting, I believe, built into that, so you could prototype interaction. But again, these were tools to prototype interaction that Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator really were not used. They were used to draw and edit images, but they weren't used for interaction particularly. The other thing I need to add is that everything I'm describing was pre-web. I actually left the field when the World Wide Web happened. I'm sort of known for saying, for me, that was the beginning of the end. That's when I began to lose interest actually in the field, even though that's when a lot of people entered the field. In the early days, it was a much clunkier, sort of ad hoc, you kind of did what you could with the tools that were available. And a lot of it was very kind of inventive, on the fly, trying to kind of kludge solutions, adapt things to do what you needed them to do. But the world I'm talking about is basically kind of the Laserdisc world that eventually became the CD-ROM world. And then the web happened, mid 90s.
It's interesting also how there's been pretty high turnover in the tools that people use day to day, even though a lot of the foundational concepts are similar. Today people will tend to use Figma or Sketch, or something like that. So you've worked in a lot of different places. What are some of the specific products that you were involved in designing?
Some of the ones that are most memorable are working on an interactive TV prototype. And again, this was pre-web, and it was for Paramount and Viacom. And I think the branding was associated with the Entertainment Tonight kind of TV show at that time. And there was a proprietary set-top box that was being developed, and I suspect shopped around among kind of major executives to decide whether they wanted to promote this infrastructure. It required a lot of infrastructure to get it off the ground. But that raised a lot of, I thought, very fascinating issues that had to do with technology and design and audience. And one of the things that I recall, and aesthetics, really, one of the things that I remember about that project was, I remember thinking of it as Battle of the Boxes. And in my mind, this is showing my bias. In my mind, there was a smart box and there was a dumb box. And they were both coming together in this product. And the smart box was a computer, and the dumb box was a TV. And somehow we had to sort of bring that all together to try to bring an interactive kind of on-demand interface kind of into kind of the sort of the kind of cable world. And so, there were two different kind of corporate cultures kind of working on this endeavor, the TV executive kind of culture and infrastructure for cable, and then, the computer people. The I would say the aesthetics, the graphical conventions, the visual conventions were very different for both of those worlds. And there were some very real kind of technical limitations that didn't really want to be admitted to. And it was a real struggle to try to design something that would be viable. But then there's a lot of internal selling, right, when you're trying to promote these kinds of projects. So a lot of political complexity and creative complexity and technical complexity. So that's the project that most comes to mind for me. Another, there are a lot of kind of vertical market software things. I remember flight booking software for Sony that they owned a kind of, I think, a big database of flight tracking information. I think it was going to be real-time access to flight information and booking information. And that was actually prototyped in HyperCard a long time ago.
For the television interactive project that you worked on, how did users interact with it? Was it something that was on their television and they used a remote to interact? Was it something that they had to have a computer, or like what was the interface that they were using?
That was the intended interface, that it would be kind of similar to streaming television now.
Mm-hmm.
In many ways, it was a precursor to streaming television, where there was a remote control and basically a screen that consisted of a menu and tiers of menus to kind of select things. One of the innovations that we came up with that I was very proud of, even though it didn't come to pass, was that we had this idea that there would be a sort of video layer on top of a menu, and the video layer would be kind of hosts. It was Entertainment Tonight was the brand at that time. And the idea was that there would be a host. It could be like a movie star or some public figure who might be the host, kind of, let's say it was Robert De Niro. I think that's the person who came to mind at the time, who might actually be your companion, your host companion, who would appear, kind of talk to you, invite you to kind of browse a menu that was behind him, of movies that were available through this service. And so the idea of kind of like hosted menus was something that we thought was a novel idea for that time. And I think that was a really good idea. I don't know if such things exist now. I don't watch all that much TV or do that much streaming right now, but I thought that was an interesting idea. And the idea was that people did have.
Yeah, definitely one before its time.
Yeah, and I do remember I remember having lots of conversations about remotes and what keys we were going to use for what, and the idea of a universal remote and what was going to be universal in terms of how we navigated kind of this particular system with this set-top box. So a lot of technical issues and a lot of unprecedented, this hasn't been done before kind of questions. One of the things I do remember, it's like you're jogging my memory as we're talking, is I remember having a conversation with, it was some senior VP, I think at Paramount, about like menu organization, because the idea was that things that were topmost on the menu, it would cost more to be prominently placed at the top of the hierarchy of a menu structure. But at that time, nobody understood what menus were and what hierarchical menus were. And I remember kind of trying to describe this and the implications for pricing different offerings at different levels. And I just remember how curious it was to have that conversation and to try to describe something that seemed so strange and foreign to the two key decision makers. So that was very challenging. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose they're probably used to working in a world where there's such a thing as physical shelf space, but not digital shelf space. And so to be able to extend that metaphor is challenging. And then, of course, there's also very important differences where a shelf is finite, but a digital shelf does not have to be finite. So that can change the interactions quite a bit as well, but while remaining sort of a very similar basic concept.
And at the same time, screen real estate is finite, right? And so that was definitely one of the parameters that we had to work with in terms of how things would be organized and presented, and any financial opportunities afforded by by those structures. Yeah.
It sounds like you were playing a bit of a role of an oracle from the future too, to sort of tell people who are working in a different paradigm, like, hey, there's this new way of doing things, and here's some of the opportunities that you can take advantage of here.
What I appreciated was just having the opportunity to kind of surface certain design challenges that had not existed before or been recognized as issues. And so to sort of be kind of in the middle of that Venn diagram between kind of design, technology, and business, that was wonderful to just sort of be in that sweet spot of invention where I could speak to a problem that, quite honestly, I don't think anybody else was seeing.
Yeah, it sounds like such an interesting time to be working with such rapid change, and both at the technological level and also business model level. How did you originally get into design? What was your path, and what about design drew you there in the first place?
I was always interested in design. I sort of grew up kind of first generation middle class, half African American, half Japanese, a kind of aesthetic and sensibility that was very different from what my Mattel toys looked like. And my father came from a very poor, large family. We were newly middle class, very acquisitive because of his financial security. We were a military family. And so I grew up in this kind of profusion of new abilities to consume. In the marketplace, I saw many kinds of things that we were able to acquire and afford. I saw that different things were different. We were stationed in Germany also when I was a child, and I noticed that German toys were different than the Mattel toys that I had, that were different from the things my mother brought from Japan. I recognized early on, even though I didn't have a word for it, that design had happened to make those things different. And so I think I always had a design awareness. And also, I loved fashion growing up. I made my own clothes. I made clothes for my mom. I made clothes that I sold to a consignment shop in Louisville, Kentucky. I made macrame handbags. It's like, and so I was a designer in that sense. I always loved crafting things and designing things. And then, when I got older, I think graphic design was I did study fashion design actually for a little while. I went to night school in Boston while I was typing insurance policies because that's what I originally was. I was not going to go to college. Graphic design was sort of just a field that I noticed and had access to studying within. And so I think I was drawn to kind of graphic design as kind of communication design. And I also felt it was a form of literacy that was empowering for people who chose to enter that world of design. And then later on, and I continue to say this now, I think I was a cultural critic essentially during those early digital years. And in many ways, for me, design was a kind of a vehicle through which I could critique culture and cultural values. Yeah, so design sort of encompassed so many different facets of value making. And I think that's ultimately what value making and value expressing, I think that's what drew me to it, actually.
This idea of cultural literacy and then also cultural critique is really interesting. Can you say a little bit more about what that means and how that manifested for you?
When we give form to something, when we form something, we are kind of inscribing cultural values. That is what forming is. And so I taught for a while in the design and management department at Parsons. And one of the things we looked at, for instance, kind of I think the first day of the class was this idea of like luxury. And then we would explore the city, kind of looking for examples of 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 the expression of that notion. So when we looked at luxury, it's like we went to the Prada store. We went to there was a store in which I don't think exists anymore that sold only rice pudding. It was in Manhattan. Talk about I mean, I won't say anything about that, but I think a store that only sells rice pudding, that's a little bit kind of over the top. Anyway, and then we looked at another store that sold very, very beautiful clothing made of Indian textiles that had been, I think, woven specifically kind of for this particular shop. So we looked at different ways that the idea of luxury was crafted into objects and retail environments through which that value was expressed. And so as a designer, kind of you're responsible for kind of forming how things are going to be, how the built environment will indeed express itself. It gets at many important questions. How is it that our built world comes to be as it is? And I'm talking in terms of more kind of like the material culture of our world. But we build institutions too, right? I think those were really the kinds of questions that interested me or became increasingly more of greater interest to me as I pursued design. And again, I think it's why I eventually left design because it's hard for me to kind of be clear about it, but I think the nutshell answer that I often give people is design is often described as sort of creative problem solving. So it's very cognitive, very, very prefrontal cortex. And I said I would tell people I left design because I was tired of solving problems. I wanted to make problems. That's what I did. I painted for 3 years, and I did not engage that problem solving mind at all. I'm not saying that problem solving mind isn't a value. It is, obviously, of course. But I think for me, as just a person, I had sort of reached the limit of my own ability to kind of engage certain mental processes that I felt were limiting. Again, still very, very valuable pursuits, but not for me as a particular person.
I know what you mean. Somewhat analogous change that I've made in the last year as I grew up in California in the Bay Area and I've been there my whole life. And about 8 months ago, I moved to Miami, which really couldn't be any more different, I think, as a city in terms of its values. And I wouldn't say that I necessarily prefer Miami's values. And in fact, I think I am much more of a San Francisco type of person, whatever that means. But there's something about having a difference in your life where it's just about making a change and living a different kind of lifestyle, which can happen when you change careers. It can happen when you change places, the people you spend time with, and it doesn't lessen the value of the other career or the other place, but it's not what you're looking for at that moment in your life.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I do, it's interesting that you mentioned kind of, kind of relocating, because it's almost like I often feel like a seed that's ended up replanting itself or being replanted kind of here, there, and elsewhere. And when you plant yourself in a different world, there is a different kind of becoming that's afforded by that. Very, very much so. I've experienced that many, many times. And I think it's very valuable, that the kind of transformation that can happen in doing that, and not everybody has the opportunity to do that. I'm blessed in that I have been able to do that many, many times, but at the same time, also, I've made certain sacrifices in order to be able to do that. So, life is bittersweet that way. It's always a matter of trade offs. That's another design concept that I found very helpful. I often describe designing as negotiating trade-offs. You get this, you give up that, and you're sort of doing that every step of the way. I think that's essentially what designing is in many ways.
I like the metaphor of the seed. It reminds me of something a friend recently told me. She said, just like a plant, a person needs to be repotted every once in a while.
I agree. I
Yeah, no,
agree.
and I couldn't have resonated more strongly with me in that particular moment.
Yeah, I think that's very true. That's definitely been my experience.
So you were talking about how the toys that you were playing with from Mattel were different from the things that you saw in Germany and the things that your mother brought from Japan. Can you try to put into words like what were the differences? Of course, there's no big generalizations, but yeah, how are they different?
Well, I can speak to some of the major things that I recognized even as a child, and some of them were very simple. They were like material things. I remember my mother's things and the things in Germany. I remember wooden things that were made of wood. I remember seeing wooden joinery, like on a wooden box my mom had brought from Japan. I remember seeing Bauhausian blocks in primary colors at German toy shop. I remember seeing kind of clear geometry. It was a lot like the Bauhaus. Things seemed very simply made, very simple, basic forms. There seemed to be an idea in Germany that out of simple forms and colors and shapes, you could make anything. So the essential vocabulary seemed very simple, out of which many different kinds of things could be created, like blocks, simple blocks and colors and stuff. So I remember the wood a lot is being present. My Mattel, my North American, United Statesian toys, I remember they were mostly metal, lithographed metal, I think, like printed metal. Sometimes they had little mechanisms built into them, like little cranks, like a music box kind of thing. I remember I had a Farmer in the Dell toy. I almost bought a replica of one recently. I found they had several of them on eBay, and I wanted one just to remind myself. I also remember things being made of plastic. This is a funny thing to say, and I feel a little kind of hesitant to say it because it's so value laden, obviously, when I say it. But I remember even as a child, something in me felt like the German toys were better than the American toys. I didn't even know what better meant, but I think I was getting at something that had to do with materiality and consumption and scales of production. I think I could feel that difference in these toys. I don't think that's just me trying to kind of romanticize that time. I think each object does embody values that are genuine and genuinely felt. And I think I felt that when I was a kid. I felt that something different was going on in this toy versus that toy versus this toy. And even though, of course, I didn't have the vocabulary or the critical analysis skills to be able to speak to that, I think I deeply, deeply felt it. I felt the difference. And yeah, we can call that culture. You can call it a lot of different things, but I do think it has to do with the way values are inscribed in objects and propagated through techniques of distribution.
I had a somewhat similar moment a few years ago. My boyfriend is from Argentina, so I spend a lot of time there now. And in Argentina, the houses have a different feeling to them than most houses in the United States. They have this like solidity to them. And so I asked his mom, who's an architect, and his dad, who is a contractor, like why do the houses feel so different here? And the answer was actually very straightforward. They said, "Oh, here we build with masonry, and so all of the walls are actually solid. In the United States, you tend to use sheetrock, things that are more mass produced, and that's why they feel better. They have a solidity to them." And
Yes.
then I asked, well, then why is there this difference? And they said, well, masonry works when you have relatively low cost labor, because putting bricks up together is very, very labor intensive. Um, whereas sheetrock is cheaper when labor is very expensive. And so it was interesting to see how, it's not to say that one is better than the other. I do like the feeling of the masonry better, but I also don't love that labor is very cheap in Argentina. That's also not wonderful. And so there's this inherent set of trade-offs where in the U.S., housing is much more democratized, and whereas in Argentina, most people don't live in very nice houses at all, and then a few very wealthy people will live in a solid masonry house. And so it's sort of choosing, like, do you prefer a somewhat flimsier feeling house but everyone can have one, or a much nicer feeling house and not everybody gets one right now?
Yeah, what a great example. Thank you for sharing that with me because I feel like that's how profound it gets, right? And if you're a designer and you are a seed designer in a seed and you're going to plant yourself somewhere to practice design, right? Where do you go and what world do you want to realize through what you're making? And again, it came over time that design was a vehicle or kind of cultural practice. I'll call it a cultural practice.
Yeah, and it comes back to what you were saying about trade-offs as well, where, if I had to decide if I wanted to be an architect in the United States or in Argentina, the trade-offs I'd be considering would be like, well, do I want to work in a system where I'll be able to make really exquisite homes that are beautiful and very sturdy, but in a context where people here aren't getting paid very much? Or do I want to make it in a place where I can build homes for a mass market? A lot of people can benefit from my designs, but maybe they're not quite so exquisite, and they feel a little bit less personalized to the particular family that's going to live there. And I don't think there's a clear right answer there. Some people might disagree on one way or the other, but it's sort of about which values do you want to be pushing in the world. And also on the margins, is there any way that you can nudge it in a particular direction that you want? Is there some way you could make it so that maybe you pay your laborers a little bit more than the average wage, and that gets reflected in your prices or something like that? Or maybe in the United States you say, I am going to build like an artisanal house, where a lot of craft workers are going to work on this. And those are decisions you can make too, as long as people are willing to pay for it.
Right. And I think you're also speaking to another kind of dimension of design that I think I felt kind of like uncomfortable with, and that is sort of the role and identity of the designer. There's a sort of cult of the superstar designer kind of thing and the superstar architect. I found all of that very cringy and sort of in so many ways. It's funny. I remember a friend of mine who was a design historian. We were talking about design and architecture, and somehow the topic of famous architects often design furniture or chairs, and I was sort of that came up in our conversation, and he just scoffed and he said, "Architects do not design chairs. They design small buildings that they expect people to sit on." I thought that was very funny and very true.
That's great. It's sort of is he pointing there to like a lack of appreciation for what the people actually want, and it's more of, this is what I want to see in the world, and you're gonna have to deal with it. And
I think that is what he was speaking to. This was a conversation many many years ago, but I think that's what he was speaking to at the time. But I think that is, people don't like to admit their own ambitions and the fact that often fuels the choices that people make. And I think design and designers, I think, have often struggled with those issues of visibility and fame. And like, people have often asked me, "Oh, well, what did you design that I would know about?" And I would say, "Well, nothing I can think of." Quite honestly, I just I was a pixel pusher. I edited pixels and did obscure prototypes for things that never saw the light of day. It's like it wasn't about like becoming a star. I don't know. I was just a worker.
Yeah.
I was just a digital worker, and I was a digital craftsperson. I enjoyed making digital things.
Yeah, I see this as a challenge that a lot of different industries face. We were just talking about architecture. There's a term I really like that describes this phenomenon called starchitecture, where it's architects who want to be stars.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
If you look at the kinds of buildings that these people make, like the types of things that are the front page of the magazine, things that get covered by international press, and frankly, most of the buildings in Dubai, for example,
Yeah.
if you really look at them, you think like, do I want to live in that? Maybe the answer for some people is yes, but the answer for me is like, no, I don't. I don't want to. It
Yes.
doesn't look like it's made for a person. It looks like it's made for to be photographed for a magazine,
Yes. Yes.
and it's not really solving humans' problems. It's solving their own problem of I want to be flashy and get famous.
I think you're also speaking to our current kind of visual culture where image is everything. And I think you're right that a lot of people kind of contrive images in the form of how people look individually, how people dress, the places people live in, where people go, so that they're Instagram worthy. Or it's we do live in such an image oriented world where people want to present in very designed ways. I think it's all very unhealthy, quite honestly. I think image is everything in our modern world. Yeah, I think that's very unfortunate, but it's what we have.
What sorts of decisions do you see designers making in the things that you hold and touch and see in your life that you think are pushing us in that direction? Like what are and if anything, what would you do differently to try to nudge it in a different direction?
Quite honestly, I do not pay attention to the designed world anymore. It used to be something that, I had antenna that just kind of noticed stuff. I don't have that anymore. I don't, it's not, my senses are not attuned to that, quite honestly. So I don't really know what people are doing. The only thing I do know is kind of how social media has sort of propagated a lot of narcissism and a lot of self-centered self-representation and presentation. That's about the only thing I really noticed that seems like a real predominant trait in our contemporary life. And actually, I mentioned this in that article on blurring that you referenced. I mentioned at the end of that article, I wrote that article in 1993. Actually, it was published in 1993. I think I wrote it a little earlier than that. I I talked about the rise of terrorism and plastic surgery at the end of that article. And they came to, I mean, it's so funny. I was surprised by how prescient that article was. I think what I appreciated in what I was able to see and witness at that time was I saw how I saw that visual culture could be very prescient. I saw that the look and feel of modern life could indeed be quite an accurate predictor of what was to come. And I'm not sure if I still feel that way. I mean, again, I don't pay attention to things in the way that I did.
But what you're saying about increasing importance of imagery in our world is probably, we use more screens and more of our time is spent looking at screens. Certainly mine is. It feels like it really elevates sight over other senses. Maybe some sound as well, because we're listening to each other, but certainly not touch or definitely not taste. I don't know of anyone who tastes their screen.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's very strange. And actually, I don't know that people are really looking so much at screens. I think people are looking at themselves a lot, too much. I think that has certain results. It creates certain results. I don't think it's a good thing.
What are some of the things that you've seen change for the better, as opposed to sort of the more self reflexivity?
Well, I'll just speak directly to this last 2 years with the pandemic and George Floyd's death. I think there is a kind of crisis happening, a crisis of values at a global scale, certainly at a national level. And I think certain issues are surfacing and being recognized and talked about. Difficult conversations are happening that had not been able to happen before. I think the pandemic has just raised all kinds of issues around just human vulnerability, frailty, issues of control. given our technological prowess and emphasis, I think and I mean the United States, I'll speak about, I think tend to cling to a kind of ideal of control, being in control or being, and I think the pandemic has really changed everything, or it's really turned that on its head. I know a lot of people are kind of in crisis. I know a lot of people have suffered terrible losses. And I think crises have a way of mobilizing attention, values, reflection, communality in ways that are really important. And I don't think that attention can be rallied otherwise. I actually feel quite heartened by this last 2 years of difficulty. I'm not sure how I feel about where things are headed. I can't say I feel particularly optimistic. But optimism is sort of the wrong word. I feel like it's a thin word. I do feel a sense of faith or faithfulness around possibility. I mean, I don't think I could be a therapist, for instance, if I didn't have that. That really, I think that's, if I bring anything to my work as a therapist, it is that I kind of hold space. I hold that value in space with another person.
The last 2 years, I think, have been especially surprising for most people, and it's, I think, caused people to rethink a lot of underlying assumptions about
Yes,
how
yeah,
the world is structured, where power lies, where capabilities lie,
yes,
and both for the better and for the worse. I think a lot of we've discovered that a lot of emperors have no clothes, but also
yes.
discovered uncovered problems that we can actually talk about.
And I think it's been very humbling, and I do appreciate that dimension of it. I mean, I'm just speaking personally. I sometimes I refer to the cosmic smackdown, and I feel like sometimes that's what it needs to come to.
I'm gonna steal that. So one last question. You mentioned that you left design right before the internet really took off, and you said for me the internet was the beginning of the end. Was that a coincidence or was that causal? Was the rise of the internet part of why you chose to leave?
Yes, it was. Very definitely. And probably stupid of me as well. But, you're talking to someone who did kind of hypertext interfaces with HyperCard. And so when the World Wide Web came and people were like, oh, you can click on things and they connect to other things, I'm like, I'm over it. I am so over it. It's like, but for people for whom it was new, it was so great. And I was just like, oh, God, I had been working with kind of proprietary interfaces, what Open Look and New Wave, Hewlett Packard, Sun, Apple, they all had their proprietary authoring tools, and weird. You had to kludge things together weirdly. The actual making of things just seems so much more interesting than just like hypertextual interfaces. It was like, oh my goodness. So that was part of it. The design challenges just didn't seem that great to me in terms of linked pages. So that was one thing. But then also the field of practice was changing. I entered the field when it was very, very obscure. Very few people wanted to go into that space. As I said, very few people with a background like mine in art history and graphic design were choosing to go into that space. And when the World Wide Web happened, it all became sexy, right? It all became glamorous. It all became the next big thing. And now everybody wanted to be part of that. And I just was like, oh goodness. Oh, now we got to be sexy. Oh, please. Please, no. And so there was that too. I did have kind of a chip on my shoulder about it. I felt like, oh, I was there first. I had that kind of grudging resentment, And so it was a combination of things, the design problems were different. The field of practice was different. I liked being in this kind of very obscure little nook and cranny, and it was becoming something very different. And so I stepped away and actually taught at that time. And then I did re-enter that field in terms of like e-business strategy consulting work. I did that. That was more, we went from B2C to B2B, and that's why I entered the B2B world. And that was interesting to me. And I saw how kind of stupid my my short-sighted dismissal of the internet had been, because a couple of years had passed, and I saw like how incredibly powerful the web had become, and how robust, the range of tools that were delivered, through the internet. So it was becoming a different world, and we talked about that seed analogy earlier. The seedling needed to plant itself elsewhere, and I felt that very strongly. It was very clear. It wasn't like I had to think about it for a long time, or it was sharp and sudden. I just knew I didn't want to do this, and I did feel like, I have to say, the fact that it was becoming like the next big thing, that put me off in a major way. I'm not a trendy person.
I think also from a more global level, like when something is very trendy like that, that means there's plenty of other people who can solve those problems. They'll come do it.
Felt like, well, but maybe that's the way it goes, right? So I can look back on it all now and kind of laugh. That's how things go, right? And it makes sense that things become popular and democratized, and lots of people get interested, and new things emerge, and so be it.
It sounds like you like to be the person hacking through the jungle with a machete as opposed to going on the road after it's already been paved and nice and smooth.
That is so true. I am very, very much that person. Yeah, I like to set sail in choppy waters, and maybe my little boat is going to be blown back to the shore, or maybe I'll end up adrift in the ocean. Who knows? But I think that's my kind of journey.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. Loretta, thank you so much for this conversation. I had a really good time, and I hope we stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was fun to talk to you.